Greetings sailors and welcome to a Halloween video, kind of. Not really, I mean it's not particularly spooky, but maybe it is a bit terrifying because it's the Kansas and it's not a good ship at the moment, it really isn't. And this is more or less the final ship that we're going to see upon release as well. I mean it might see some tweaks, but I think we're beyond the stage where we're going to see any drastic changes to it. I can summarise what's good about this ship in relatively short order. It has got a lot of 16-inch guns, it has got pretty good range, it's got pretty good AA, and it's got pretty good torpedo protection. Nearly everything else is pretty much inferior to anything else it might see at Tier 8. And there's even some Tier 7s I'd rather take over this, quite frankly. It's just not a good experience at all. And it has some very significant weaknesses to go along with those 12, 16-inch guns. So where do I even start? Well, the speed is kind of an obvious place, I suppose. With the Sierra Mike flag, you can get it to just over 23 knots. And although the turning radius is decent for a battleship, it's not that much less than the North Carolina. And because the improved energy retention that these days is really only found on British light cruisers, you used to also get that as a feature on the New Mexico and the Colorado. And with this line being brought in for testing, they actually dropped that feature from New Mexico and Colorado, and none of these ships benefit from that either. So it's kind of a downgrade for those two ships. And the new 3 ships would have definitely benefited just from being able to retain that bit more that bit more speed in a turn, because as it is, you start turning hard and you get down to 16 knots, sometimes less than that, and you are going to be maneuvering a lot in this thing because you do need to do your best to dodge incoming fire. You just don't have the speed, so at that point all you can do is twist and turn and hope that's enough. In terms of the guns, I think everybody knows about the 40-second reload that these ships have, including also, of course, the California that they introduced, which I still don't see the point of. You know, that kind of a lot of what I say about this ship and the Minnesota and the Vermont as well, it also goes for the California, but that one you actually have to pay money for. This one at least you won't have to, because it's going to be a tech tree ship. But yeah, these are 16-inch guns at least, but they are inferior to the guns that the New Mexico has. Not New Mexico, North Carolina. Both start with an N, same ship practically. Now the reload, okay, it does have a whole extra triple turret compared to North Carolina, so you can kind of live with the reload, and at least on Tier 9 and Tier 10 you can also choose to get a bit of a faster reload with your equipment setup. You can either take a bit of a faster reload, or you can take is it better accuracy or more range? I can't remember. I think it's better accuracy in that last slot, but Kansas doesn't get access to that, so you're still stuck with that base 40 seconds, and the only way to actually reduce that is to have adrenaline rush and take a bunch of damage, which, believe me, will not be a problem. It doesn't end there, however. The shells, the AP shells specifically, are also inferior, and that's also true for the Minnesota. They do less damage, they are lighter shells, they have a slightly higher muzzle velocity, but because they're lighter they're going to lose more penetration over distance. And so although the range you can get this to is about comparable, I think the base range is a little less than North Carolina actually. So North Carolina, it's not like this has anything over the North Carolina in terms of range, but you can also take a spotter plane as well as the range upgrade in order to get it out to fairly ridiculous levels. But just the amount of time the shells take to get there and the amount of penetration they lose over the distance when you're firing at extreme ranges makes it a really inefficient long range engager. You know what I mean? It's not good at that kind of long range firefight. It just doesn't particularly have the shells to do that. But it's also not very good at close-up fights either, or even mid-range fights. There's not really a comfortable range for this ship. In this particular scenario here, there's a lot of the enemy team here, but they're not particularly pushing us. And I'm with a whole bunch of allies, although our other tier 8, the Bismarck, is AFK and is going to be AFK for the entire game. But we're going to win despite having one of our top tier ships just never be in the game, fortunately. But the reason why this is a relatively comfortable situation right now is because there's a lot of ships around me and I'm not having to run away anywhere. Although I am starting to think about it at this stage, because this is a ship that just doesn't run at all. It is, again, compared to the North Carolina, actually a bit less stealthy. It's nothing special in that regard. And because you can't run, because your armour means that you are quite vulnerable to HE spam, because it's not particularly amazing at blocking AP shells either. It then means that if you're in that situation where you have to go on the run and to try and hopefully get unspotted, it's just not going to happen. And anyone that's ever played Colorado or New Mexico or New York knows all too well, and particularly the Colorado, where you're starting to get a lot of ships being a lot faster that you have to deal with. It's all too easy to get yourself in a situation on a flank where suddenly you're the one everyone's focusing on and you just can't get unspotted, especially if you get set on fire. It's not like this thing has got shorter cooldown on its damage control party, for example. Talking of survivability, I also want to mention one other thing that this is missing, one other way in which it's inferior from the North Carolina, and in fact even inferior compared to the Colorado. It has a completely standard heal, as does the Vermont and the Minnesota. This is by far the most baffling decision in terms of balance that these ships have been given, that Wargaming has taken towards them. You don't get the enhanced US battleship heal. Once upon a time it was only, I think, Colorado that had it, and then the other US battleships were buffed so that they get more hit points back every time you pop a heal. I think it's 0.66% of your health per second versus 0.5 is the standard. So you couple that with how slow this is, how vulnerable it is to HE spam. It's not super duper resistant to fire or anything like that, and this thing can go down very, very easily. I've actually had a really rough time surviving games in any of these ships, just because it lacks the survivability to weather sustained fire, and it also cannot run away, cannot stealth up. So all in all, it's a pretty horrible experience for the most part. I mean, this game's not been too bad, but mostly because the enemy team has just not been any particular kind of serious threat. I might as well have been in literally any other tier 8 battleship and I'd have done the exact same kind of amount of damage. Hell, I might have actually done better, because one thing I didn't point out about these guns when I was talking about how inferior they are, North Carolina gets a sigma of 2.0, this has a sigma of 1.5. I'm just going to let that sink in for a second. 1.5. That's what you expect to find on a tier 5 or a tier 6 battleship. It's not good. It's really not good. It can still do some damage. I think despite everything, I can at least not complain too much about this in terms of doing damage, but it definitely is way more of a struggle in games where you're down tiered compared to the North Carolina, even though that's got fewer guns. Just between the faster reload, the better accuracy, and the much more flexible nature of that ship. So it's really quite hard to commend this in any particular way, shape or form. Now, I did mention the AA, and that does lead me to point out that it does get a defensive. All three ships, tier 8 to tier 10, get a defensive. And okay, that's quite nice. The AA numbers, when you look at them, it's actually less good than the North Carolina, but once you pop a defensive, obviously, that helps out quite a bit. However, it's got fewer dual purpose secondaries giving you AA, the North Carolina. Actually, I'm not sure if that's true. Is it fewer? I know it gives it gives fewer flak bursts than North Carolina, but for some reason I forgot to check whether that means it's actually got fewer secondary guns. Not that the secondary guns are like, it's not got long range secondaries at all, just completely standard secondary, so it's not even really worth mentioning them. But the majority of your AA, like most battleships, is from your short range mounts. And because you're that much more vulnerable to sustained HE spam, those get depleted really quickly. I've had games, I'm not sure I've ever had a match where I've completely had my AA stripped, but I've had games where it's gone down to sub 20% of my AA left. Where, you know, it might not even be like 12 minutes into a game and most of my AA is gone already. And at that point, the defensive, I mean, it's still boosting your AA, but boosting like 17% of your total is... That's not even quite boosting it back up to the level you had at the start of the match when you were undamaged. So at the start of a match, your AA is good, and anyone that flies into your AA bubble and you pop that defensive, unless it's a tier 10 carrier, it's not going to do that much against a tier 10 carrier. But against tier 8, tier 6 carriers, yes, it's quite effective. But by the time you get to the end of a match, typically you're going to have way less of that. So it's hard to commend that as a selling point of this ship. You can't really commend any ship pretty much on its AA, apart from a very select few, such as the high-tier European destroyers, for example. So, yeah, overall, Kansas is a bit of a miserable experience, and I think it needs at least some buffs to its survivability. Some changes to firepower would be nice as well. I mean, if they'd given you an option of guns, for example, that might have been an interesting way to do it. Maybe give you twin turrets instead of triple turrets in exchange for a faster reload and possibly better Sigma. But instead, we have this line of ships that, although on the face of it, it's kind of interesting to have them in as you know, variations of US battleship design from the 20s and the 30s. Yeah, it just ends up just being a absolutely unfun experience, and I honestly think this is one of the least fun tier 8 ships. It's right up there in my book with Siliwangi for just being a ship where you ask, why is this here? But unlike Siliwangi, you know, not a premium. You don't have to pay actual money for it, just some time and possibly sanity. So, I hope you all have a spooky Halloween wherever you are, and are able to maybe forget the woes of the world for a couple of hours. Goodness knows there's a lot of them to forget at the moment. And if you've enjoyed this video, you can do all the usual things down underneath it. And of course, as always, stay tuned for more.